name's Jess, and I'm a Balgu woman, and I live here on beautiful Wajak Noongar Budja. And today I'm going to speak a little bit about Indigenous cultural objects that are held in museums, but also a bit about what we can learn from Indigenous ways of passing on our cultural knowledge. So when I was growing up, there was this beautiful special object that we had at home that had been passed down by my great-grandmother, Daisy Karana. And this was a woman who had raised my own mother, but who at a young age had been forced to leave behind her Balgu country, her family, and her culture. And this object, which is a special stone that's linked to healing, which I can still recall the cool weight of in my hand, was one of very few things my grandmother was able to pass on because she'd really lived her life in fear. Her language had been banned, her cultural practices had been forbidden, and most of her community had been widely dispersed. And, along with this object, there were just a few, fragments, bits of language, bits of song, that were these precious tethers to an entire world of culture that had thrived since time immemorial, but which had been greatly impacted by the great destructive waves of colonization. And you might imagine what it might be like, for my great-grandmother to have almost nothing left from your family life and your culture to pass on and be forced to sort of try to pass on these few fragments, often in fear. So it's from this perspective that I sort of view the place that I now work every day, which is in a museum. And this museum is not a museum as you might typically think of a museum. It's not got a lot of big galleries that the public can visit, but it's basically the behind-the-scenes parts of the museum, so archives and storerooms and things like that. So let me conjure a picture of it for you. Imagine this great, cavernous, underground warehouse that's filled with shelves upon shelves upon shelves, stacked high with hundreds of boxes, each filled with many layers of carefully wrapped up objects. And these objects are part of a collection of some 13,000 items, most of them Indigenous cultural heritage, and that are each precious tethers to entire cultural worlds. And they're things like bark paintings, string belts, spearheads, grinding stones, paintings, basically any kind of material that could reflect people's everyday lives and their societies. And they were mostly collected by different anthropologists who were doing research out in the field. And although this is a very sterile and clinical environment, and it's frankly not an ideal place for these very precious objects, I've nevertheless seen Aboriginal people, when they come into the museum to visit, be profoundly affected when they come into contact with their cultural heritage. So I've seen people stand in front of massive paintings and be transported back to childhood memories, or crying when they hold for the first time something that was carved by a grandparent, or looking on in astonishment as they see that their ancestors recorded all this deep cultural knowledge and lore in drawings that were at the time handed over to anthropologists because they were so much in fear as to what was happening under colonization. So for the most part, museums sort of try to keep everything in this state of preservation and stasis. But for Aboriginal people, we want to connect to our cultural materials in much more direct and meaningful ways, in ways that reawaken these objects back into their cultural worlds. So I've seen people hold these objects, I've seen them sung to, used as part of ceremony, and sometimes when things are returned to Aboriginal communities, they may be reburied back onto country to be part of that living country, or they may be kept in special keeping places so the community can access them. As well, there's been quite a number of Indigenous artists who have been quite critical of museums, and they've gone over to museums in the UK and Europe and made new artworks in response to the museum's hoarding tendencies. So there's a particularly poignant work for me made by the artist Judy Watson. So she went and viewed a whole lot of objects that are held in the British Museum in London, and she made a new series of prints and drawings called The Holes in the Land, so referring to those holes on country where things have been removed from, but also a very profound sense of loss. So we kind of might ask ourselves, do we really feel that connected to museums as these great storehouses of objects from the past? Especially as we live in a very fast-paced culture where we can access all kinds of information online, do we really feel that museums can help us teach us about our own culture? But then again, it's also been said that it's precisely because we live in these very complex and global societies where our everyday objects are very disposable, that our cultural memory is becoming rather shallow. And in fact, there's been a boom in the number of museums growing around the world for many decades, almost as though in this very fast and forgetful times, we want to hold on to this idea that there are these places that are preserving things physically for us. But do these objects really represent us or make us feel connected to our culture going forward, especially when they're displayed behind glass or, even worse, as at the museum I work at, kept in storage? So it's in this point that I think we have a lot to learn from Indigenous cultures and our sense of very deep time and very deep cultural memory. I was recently up in the Pilbara at Murujuga, where they have these incredible rock art sites. And there are artworks there out on rocks that are dating back over 45,000 years and representing many other points in time. And they're kind of scattered across the landscape like this great living archive. And at the same time, in that region, you have all these Aboriginal art centres that are supporting Indigenous artists to keep passing on their cultural knowledge, passing on many stories that are even present out on those rock art sites. And it reminded me of a very important difference between the kind of cultural memory that we store in the museum through kind of information and objects and the sense of cultural memory that comes through Indigenous culture. Because for us, our memories actually live out on country, they're part of country, and they're passed on by people. And sadly, many of our heritage sites are, of course, still threatened by activities like mining. And holes in the land become holes in our cultural memory. But on a more positive note, what we can see happen when we support Aboriginal people to become connected in meaningful ways to their cultural heritage, actually able to use it or access it or have it back, when we're able to care for our sacred sites, when we're able to care for country, then we have access to a cultural archive that's infinitely more deeper than the largest modern Western museum. And all of us here, as Australians living on Indigenous country, we have the opportunity to connect with the oldest living continuous cultures in the world. And when we look to Indigenous knowledge, we start to see the very profound connections between people and place and the objects we make as well, and how all of these things interact to carry our culture forward in an era of speed and disposability. So from an Indigenous perspective, our country is like a great living, evolving museum. It carries our stories, our histories, our memories, and the seeds of our future as well. Thank you.